Hello, my name is Mark Bell. I'm a graduate student at Utah State University, and my study and research interests revolve around cinnamon teal and their nesting, nest site selection, and nesting success in the wetlands of Great Salt Lake wetlands. The areas of northern Utah and the Great Salt Lake wetlands are an arid region, and they are limited primarily by the water available. The majority of the wetlands that are located in these areas are along the eastern shore of Great Salt Lake in this area here. And what we find here is that there's large yearly variations in the water that's available for wetlands and for water birds and waterfowl. This video here kind of highlights the variation that we see year to year. You'll notice there's a color difference up here. This is the north arm of Great Salt Lake. This is the south arm. That's because of a railroad causeway that blocks the water passage between the two. And so the salinity of the north arm is higher and has different algae. But pay attention to these edges along, and you can see how the shore changes over time, fluctuates high to low. And then up in here is a primary area of wetlands, and you can see when this starts, it was flooded and there was a lot of water. That's because that was a 2 to 3 year period where Great Salt Lake received tremendous amounts of snowpack in the mountains as well as spring precipitation. My study areas are located in waterfowl management areas located along the eastern shore here. So 4 of these are state waterfowl management areas, 1, 2, 4, and 5. And number 3 is a national refuge run by the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, and it is the largest area here of which I find nests and do my study. This is an aerial view that shows a portion of Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. And as you can see, these impoundments are outlined by these dikes, which are created by the managers to hold water in the spring as the snow runoff is coming downstream. They collect as much as they can and hold it in these impoundments so that there's water available for the wetlands and for the birds throughout the growing season and the nesting period. And in the spring, these impoundments fill up, and for the most part, the only vegetation that's available for ducks, which are selecting nest sites, is located along the edge of these dikes. And it's a very narrow strip of vegetation, and it's a very limited amount of vegetation that's available. There are some areas of upland vegetation, but for the most part, in these waterfowl management areas and the refuges, the majority of the vegetation available is limited to these narrow dikes. Historically, these wetlands housed hundreds of thousands of birds. Prior to the 1980s, it was called a duck factory. The Bear River Delta was known for producing hundreds of thousands of ducks, and there were a dozen or so species that nested here to great numbers. Currently, we don't see that anymore. The number of ducks has reduced to thousands, and rather than having a dozen species, we see 3 primary species: the mallard, gadwall, and cinnamon teal. These areas are of primary importance for cinnamon teal as compared to mallard and gadwall, and that's because of their limited breeding range. Mallard and gadwall have breeding ranges that cover all of, if not most of, North America. They are very successful in nesting in areas such as the prairie pothole regions here in the northern US and southern Canada. And all over the US, they have places to nest. Whereas cinnamon teal are limited. And as you can see here, the primary area is located in the arid regions of the Western United States. Great Salt Lake is located in the center of that geographically, but also it is the heart of their breeding range in the sense of that an estimated 60% of the species are found here in northern Utah wetlands during the breeding season. So with the variation in water and the limited area for selecting nests, we can see that this might cause some issues for these ducks. So some of the questions I'm seeking to answer with my study are: first, how successful are nests in these wetlands? What is the greatest cause of nest failure? what nest site traits are ducks selecting for along these dikes, and do those traits protect against depredation? So these studies like this have been done all over. Primarily, they've been done in the prairie pothole region, and hundreds of studies of this nature have been done, but few have been done specifically for cinnamon teal and specifically in wetlands of this type. To locate nests, I used a modified chain dragging method where I constructed a boom out of 2x4s, which extends out the side of a pickup, and there's these chains attached 15 to 20 centimeters apart, and they drag through the vegetation, and they're chains, so they're heavy, and they sink down through the vegetation to the ground. And as they drag through the vegetation, they will bump or touch the nesting hens and flush them out of the vegetation, at which time a technician that's in the back of the truck can identify the species as well as locate where the duck flushed from, and we can locate the nest site. I should note here, often there's concerns raised that this might damage the vegetation, the ducks, or the nests, but we have found very little to no damage done to the nests or to the ducks or vegetation as we drive 5 to 10 kilometers per hour and keep it pretty slow so that the chains just kind of flow over the surface and no damage is done. The nests that we find are monitored every 2 weeks as we rotate through the different areas searching for the nests, and we check on the old nests as well as find new nests. We place game cameras on as many nests as possible to help us identify possible nest predators. And then we take measurements at the nest site as well as a controlled or a paired control site that is randomly selected. The vegetation measurements that we take are first vertical obstruction, which is the concealment from overhead view. So it would be the concealment from an aerial predator or from looking down at the top of the nest. And then lateral obstruction, which is concealment of the nest from horizontal view, which would be mammalian or terrestrial predators. We also measure the vegetation height. I do that by running a transect parallel to the road as well as perpendicular to the road, which is pictured here in this picture. This is a transect along a measuring tape parallel to the dike or the road along the top of the dike. And we take an average of the height as well as the standard deviation, which gives us a measure for the variation in the height. I also measured the width of the dike from the edge of the water to the edge of the road, and then the height of the tallest neighboring plant. The predators that we found, there's 4 primary predators, those being skunks, coyotes, red foxes, and raccoons. Skunks and coyotes are native to this area, and they've naturally occurred here for hundreds of years, but the red foxes and raccoons are novel predators. They have been introduced in the last few decades and are new to this area. And what they've done has, they not being raccoons, especially not being as territorial, they have increased the number of predators drastically in these areas. So from what we used to see to what we have now can partially be explained by the amount of predators. And by that I mean the number of ducks and the production we saw in the past as compared to now can be explained by the number of predators. Here we have a skunk that's visiting a nest, caught him on camera. And then this little video shows a pair of raccoons visiting a nest. You'll see the eyes of the second one kind of go past in the back there. And what we found in total in 2019 was 467 nests in all of these 5 study areas. And in 2020, we found half of that, 240 nests across all areas. Interestingly enough, the proportion of gadwall to mallard to cinnamon teal remained similar throughout the year, throughout 2019 and 2020, even though we see half the number of nests in 2020. And here, this is a camera that was placed on a nest that was successful. So you can see the little ducklings here, and they're happy and doing good and about to head off to the water. So it's great to see that at least one nest was successful. As far as predators go, got ahead of myself. our total nests here, 467. Out of that total, we found 227 were depredated in 2019. And of our 240 in 2020, we found 209 depredated, which gives us an apparent survival rate of 45% in 2019 and 8% in 2020. And it's estimated that in the prairie pothole region, researchers have found that 22% nesting success is needed to sustain a duck population, to keep it maintained or to increase it. And so in 2019, we found we definitely had that, but in 2020, we did not. And there was extreme variations between the 2 years, which I'll explain in another slide or two. Here's a picture of a raccoon. He's selecting his egg, sizing it up, about ready to probably take a big bite out of the top. And then here is a little weasel who's come up to a nest. As far as predators go, we found we had 32 nests that were depredated in 2019 that had cameras on them. And of those nests, we were able to identify 7 raccoons, 14 skunks, 1 coyote, 1 red fox, 1 gull, and 1 weasel. 6 were unknown. In 2020, we had 28 nests that were depredated that had cameras, and 13 of those nests were depredated by raccoons, 4 by skunks, and 2 by cranes. And the cranes are pictured, one of the pictures is here. So there's a series of pictures that came along with this one where the camera caught the crane kicking the hen out of her nest and then pecking at her nest and consuming the eggs. Here's the red fox that we found, and then here's another raccoon. These maps show the distribution of the nests across the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. So this stretch of dike right here from one edge all the way to the other is about 15 miles. And so we drag one side and then turn around and drag the other. And we found quite a few nests here in 2019, as you can see. And the map below shows red triangles for the nests that were depredated and green squares for nests that were successful. Some of the patterns that we're starting to tease out of this is that we notice that more of the depredated nests are on either side of the dikes, especially this side over here. We don't see any successful nests along this portion. And this is a section that is closest to human populations, which is likely a place that supports higher populations of raccoons and skunks. And then we see areas through the center where there's a higher density of nests and a higher rate of success in these areas. And in 2020, we see the same distribution of nests. These are cinnamon teal nests. We see the same distribution all the way along the dike, and we see the same pattern, but just a little bit stronger of the edges being depredated and the successful nests being located in these center areas where there are more nests and a higher density. We see these same patterns for mallard, although there's fewer of them, but we see the same distribution as well as the same areas depredated and the same for gadwall. With the vegetation data that I collected, I was able to run some generalized linear mixed models and then run some AIC analysis to select which model and which of these vegetation traits that we measured for were most likely to explain the selection of duck nests, of nest sites. And the top model showed the ducks were selecting for vertical concealment, which is concealment from overhead view. And then second was the height of the surrounding vegetation. So to show an example of this, we have this first picture on the left where this is saltgrass and then some cheatgrass mixed in up here at top. And both of these grasses are short and thinner grasses. They occur more typically closer to the water edge, and they are much shorter and grow to be 15, 20 centimeters tall usually. Compared to this picture over here on the right, I'm kneeling down at a nest, and you can see this is an early, this is early in the nesting season, mid to early June, and you can see this grass is already up to my shoulders. So this is an example of the grass that ducks were selecting for most commonly. as well as the vegetation that they were most successful in concealing their nests from predators in. As I stated earlier, these years were very significantly different. There was great differences in the precipitation that was received in the springtime. In 2019, we had high precipitation, which facilitated for an early green up and allowed for higher quality nesting material. And it's hypothesized that as ducks are migrating north and they stop over at stopover sites, if they find an area that has high enough quality or good quality nesting habitat, that they will remain there. And my data supports that and shows that as the ducks came in 2019, the area was of a high enough quality that more stayed and fewer continued on farther north to find other areas. Versus in 2020, which was a low precipitation year, the vegetation was much shorter and was grazed down quicker by the geese in the spring. And so there was lower quality vegetation for the duck hens as they were selecting nest sites. And that contributed to the lower nest density as fewer ducks selected sites in these areas. Another big difference was due to COVID-19 in 2020, managers were unable to continue with their predator removal programs due to regulations. They could not have their employees out there working. And so no predators were removed early in the spring of 2020 versus 2019 where they were. And we see that with the higher number of duck nests in 2019, we had a much higher apparent rate of success versus 2020. It was hypothesized back in the early 80s and prior to the 80s that duck nesting and duck production was so high in these areas that predator swamping was occurring. And that would be supported by my data in 2019 that because of the higher nesting density, the predators were swamped and there was a higher nesting success rate versus 2020 when the predators were not swamped and they were able to depredate more nests. So these areas of the arid West and northern Utah are starkly different from other areas where ducks have been studied before. The areas of prairie potholes and other marshes where there's vast areas of vegetation and larger patches of vegetation for the ducks to select for nests, that doesn't occur here in these wetlands. And so because of that, we can't assume that all of those studies directly apply here as they, just because they're ducks. And so we have to take into account that the ducks here are working with a deficit now. There is high water development happening, so less water reaches the wetlands, which causes less of a green up in the spring, which lowers the quality of vegetation, as well as there are novel predators. And because these predators are new, we have found that raccoons especially are becoming a primary nest predator. And because they're in such high abundances, they cannot be swamped by the few ducks that nest here on typical years. So these areas need some more attention and need some more research so we can find ways to help or to instigate the success of these nests. And one of the ways to do that is by managing for dense nesting cover and encouraging the growth of these areas beyond or into the areas where there's shorter grass and lower quality vegetation for nesting. And with that, I thank you for your time. Have a good day.